This is the Open University.
Hello again, my faithful followers, my students. I have these old books of press clippings. When you first start making music, it's all terribly exciting that you're sort of following in the footsteps of your heroes. In my case, obviously David Bowie, but also Joseph Kay, who were press darlings in the early 80s. I didn't get the amount of press that Joseph Kay got with my first band. I moved to London in the mid-80s and started making records with Mike Allway through L Records in late 1985. The first album came out in 86. And I started getting press. And that was really exciting because I'd been a reader of the music press. The British music press at that time, you have to remember, there was 3 weekly papers, New Musical Express, Melody Maker and Sounds. They came out weekly, pretty much on the same day, I think Thursdays. Actually, that was one exciting thing about moving to London was you wouldn't get those papers in Aberdeen, for instance, until Friday. But in London, you could even get them on, I think, Wednesday afternoon. There were select vendors in the centre of London who would get them then Thursday for the rest of London. And then they'd sort of spread outwards like waves. Very slow board speed on the old modems back in those days. Oops, there were no modems. This was the kind of jungle drums of the music culture at the time, were these papers. There were also things like Smash Hits, Record Mirror, slightly more specialized or more mass market. And I was actually dating a journalist who was writing for Smash Hits, who also wrote for The Face and got me into The Face and all the rest of it, someone called Vicky. So I'd go out with Vicky to these press lig kind of events where she'd get free tickets for concerts and launches and Smash Hits parties and all sorts of things. Sylvia Patterson was very dominant in setting the tone at the time for Smash Hits, and she was also an acquaintance. But let's see what's in these. I don't know how far through we'll get. I think these go from 1985 to about 1990. And I stopped keeping these little books of clippings after a while because the press, I guess, was not as much as it had been in terms of quantity, but also it didn't mean as much to me after the turn of 1990 onwards, when I'd sort of given up on my real mainstream bid for fame after Hairstyle of the Devil. So this was the exciting period of getting press for me. And I'm going to try and video these articles and edit it together, see if that works. There's a little review of Tender Pervert in the very front of this here. I can't even get it out. It says, Momus, the Tender Pervert creation. The third album from he who some consider Scotland's answer to Jacques Brel. Maybe that's all it says, that one. He who, terrible writing. I mean, the music press was very, very badly written and edited and politically very suspect as well. I've mentioned before in these broadcasts, these narrowcasts, that when it came to things like riots, the music press was extremely conservative, if not reactionary, and would tell you to dance, not riot. So here, Chris Heath, who is also a Smash Hits person, retires to a padded cell and battles through this month's final mountain. So we have felt reviews here, and the Dream Academy, Hips Weight, Momus, The Beast of Three Backs, my first EP, reviewed by Chris Heath. These perversely awkward acoustic fables are thoroughly recommended. 3 sensitive swipes at the incidental moments in life that mean everything. Well, that's a very nice review. Thank you, Chris. Chris went on to write a very good book about the Pet Shop Boys, which I bought. Very interesting stylist. Part of that Smash Hits school, it was very influential. It was probably the most influential thing. I really was formed in terms of reading the music press by Penman and Morley and those pretentious, inverted commas, writers from the early 80s. But by the time I got into the game as Momus, those people had really been sidelined. Morley went on to sort of be the press officer for ZTT Records and writing books and appearing on television and stuff like that, becoming the Roland Barthes of post-pop. Smash Hits became the template for the pop writing of the time, and it was deliberately trivial in a sort of almost Warhol-esque way. It was very visually oriented. It was about getting the posters and pictures of your favorite pop stars. And Morley had, in some way, heralded a return to a new set of pop values. So Smash Hits was really a kind of unintended example of what he'd been talking about when he was writing about shiny, bright, yellow, new pop, Haircut 100 and all the rest of it, and ABC and all that stuff, which I wasn't a fan of. I resisted, really. I was much more into my Wire offshoots, Gilbert and Lewis and people like that. Here's one of my first interviews. I'm not even sure what this appeared in. It looks like maybe City Limits, or I'm not sure. Momus, Tumbling Acoustic Fables. It says, pop music, the young happy sounds of Madonna, Wham and Duran. According to Nicholas Curry, a quiet young Scotsman who records under the name Momus, that's just for people to dance and meet to. He sounds disapproving. Well, it says disproving. So what's Momus for? Perhaps, he smiles wryly, after they've danced and met and the inevitable breakup has happened, they might find some consolation in Momus, to laugh at their own unhappiness, find it touching and ridiculous at the same time. Blah, blah, blah. And this is Jamming magazine. Jamming. What was Jamming magazine? I don't know. Oh, again, that's Chris Heath writing the article for Jamming, though. Oh, okay. Rejoicing on its own is so sterile, it doesn't ring true. I think life does have shadows, I'm quoted as saying. These tumbling acoustic fables, as influences, he admits, Jacques Brel, Lou Reed's The Bed, Joni Mitchell, of all people, and early David Bowie, are his first work since masterminding The Happy Family, blah, blah, blah. I'm always trying, he explains cryptically, to get to the edge of the unspeakable and the horrible, to civilize it. Like reclaiming land in Holland, I suppose. I want to make sense of extremity. In his songs, Little Flashes of Swelling Everyday Torments, he does this brilliantly. But he's less sure about interviews. This is his first. So my first interview was with Chris Heath. I'd forgotten that. The language one explains things in is disgusting, he spits. It's self-indulgence. So that's reminds me of another thing, which is that as a Scottish person coming to London, you're kind of a foreigner, you're kind of a barbarian at the gates. And some of the stereotypes of Calvinism, Puritanism, me disapproving of the young happy sounds of pop and of Wham and Madonna and stuff, that's kind of an English person's projection of stereotypes onto a Scottish person, I would say, because you had to, you didn't have to. Paul Haig, for instance, the singer in Joseph K, didn't move to London. Edmund Collins from Orange Juice did. He had a house up in North London somewhere, Walthamstow or so, I think, not sure. But it was an option to stay in Scotland, but you knew that your career would suffer. And interestingly enough, I often say that, well, I didn't get articles by Paul Morley, for instance, about me, and therefore I didn't get pushed. But Paul Morley did write about Paul Haig very flatteringly, and it didn't work. So it's not necessarily a given that more press support would have pushed my career further. I think in the way I was forced to go to the mainstream and to have a single A listed on daytime Radio 1, for instance, to get round to the gatekeepers like John Peel, who were not into my stuff, probably was quite a good way for things to turn out. I really had to go straight to the big table, as it were. Here's an early review of Circus Maximus from A Bucket of Brains. This is some fanzine. I've always been a sucker for the very British elements in Rock's Rich Mosaic. Rock's Rich Mosaic, or Rich Tapestry, was the kind of laughable meme that the weekly press talked about a lot. Totally mockingly, blah, blah, blah. So this is where I'm getting compared to Robert Wyatt, Barrett, Ayres, Coyne, Drake, Otway, Thompson, Stanshall, through to the current generation of Hitchcock, Cope, Roland, Nicely, Bid, even Madness. But quirky is not quite the right term. So, and then the final paragraph, written by someone called Nigel Cross. Circus Maximus is still too novel for me to know which side of the fence to come down on, but if, like myself, you're beginning to look to your own back doorstep for pleasures fresh to investigate in the face of the mass colonial cultural imperialism this magazine has recently been guilty of perpetrating, probably the last article he wrote for it, then Momus is the place to start looking. This is an early... Actually, that's my second. I'll go to the first enemy piece about Momus. Momus in Love, which of course is a play on Moments in Love, which was Art of Noise's hit from about that time. This is in the Thrills section, which was probably your first enemy exposure, was in Thrills, which is kind of a up and coming, bubbling under kind of section. I posed for the photograph out on the King's Road with these punks who were kind of... By this time, punks were like a tourist attraction, so these guys were used to being paid to pose for photographs for tourists, and I just posed as a tourist with them. And this is Jim Shelley, who I think now is a TV critic for The Sun or the Daily Mail or something, one of these tabloids. He was a very sensitive, pale young man back in the day, and rather pretty. I remember him being impressed by his prettiness. There is something missionary about it. Pop's the most conservative art form, I'm quoted as saying. It's outlived its own inherent interest and excitement. So already this sense of I'm coming to this medium and it's already dead or dying. It's already a moribund medium, and I'm an epigone. I'm not of the great generation of the baby boomers. The sense of being, maybe 15 years too late for the really exciting years of pop and rock. I want to introduce things into pop like the Bible, Dante, and so on, things people consider to be conservative, and show they're more radical, more challenging and disturbing than pop could ever be. So that's quite an interesting statement of kind of the radicality of conservatism. It's a very 80s position, isn't it, really? There's something in common already with people like Peter Greenaway, who... There's a return to order in the 80s. I always think postmodernism, it's a retro movement in that it's reviving old forms like classicism and whatever, but it's doing it with the knowledge, a sort of winking knowledge of post-structuralism and, 20th century avant-garde behaviors. So I guess it's me sort of declaring some kind of... calling time on the sort of the useless, radical pseudo-rebellion of rock music and the sort of, the outward rebellion, which seemed to me to have really turned into a mainstream conformism, the conformism of pure individuality, using Confederate flags and proclaiming that no laws and rules apply to you and all the rest of it, that you're a maverick, all that sub-anarchic crap that I've never really accepted. I see freedom as really being some sort of contract you make with the terms of your own constriction. So I guess it was more interesting to go back to the Bible and Dante and try to find foundational texts of the West and then deconstruct them from within. So obviously Derrida and all those people were part of my plot. The thin, freckled face of the modern-day Momus, a 25-year-old straw-haired, well-spoken Scot by the name of Nick Curry. I got this a lot, well-spoken. A kind of, again, a sort of double-edged sword. It's not that great to be well-spoken in a world where rebellion and being working class were prized very highly. White, angry energy of the working class was the kind of cliche of what rock was supposed to be. And so I have my present mission. I pondered the chances of my present mission and conclude with nervous, earnest enthusiasm, and for a god of cynicism, a distressing degree of optimism. I actually have great faith that things which are heartfelt, which have imagination and create atmospheres in people's heads, real writing, all in caps, can become popular, can find an audience. Perhaps I'm not living in the real world, the 80s world. Perhaps I'll be a disillusioned man at 30 in 1990. I was moderately disillusioned, but not massively at 30. Perhaps, but sitting in his cramped but comfortable Sloane Square bedsit with its packed picador bookstand, red guitar, the benign Kafka postcard on the tiny square bed, I wouldn't bet on it, says Shelley. She asked me to stay and I stole her room. That Bowie line kind of applies because my French girlfriend, Katrine, lived in this tiny room just off Sloane Square. And I kind of took it over by stealth because the old hippie who ran that flat, a guy called Mick, who was a bootlegger, he wanted to surround himself with girls, as we all do. And he wouldn't have given me the room, but because I kind of moved in stealthily, I kind of put roots down, and then it was harder for him to throw me out. And So I stayed there for 5 years, and it was actually a really strange time. I got my rent paid by the Kensington and Chelsea Council. I was signing on the dole most of that time, and but living in the most luxurious and wealthy part of London at the time. So I had this experience, but also, again, the King's Road was past its peak just as rock music and pop music were. It had been the place in the 60s with places like the Chelsea Drugstore, this fantastic record and book shop where a McDonald's now, by the time I moved there, McDonald's was the Chelsea bookstore, the Chelsea Drugstore. Granny Takes a Trip, all these famous shops had gone and been replaced by Next, Tesco, McDonald's. So it wasn't what it had been, but it was a very wealthy place. And I had a strong sense of kind of puritanical resentment against that, because I was a poor person. Although I was well-spoken, I was not wealthy. I was just living from hand to mouth, really. I used to eat every day in the Chelsea kitchen, pretty much, get chicken Kiev takeaways. The first Momus missive is with us, blah, 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 and then he describes the EP. Talking with the slightly gauche, self-mocking air of the academic, quoting proudly, fidgeting constantly, Curry goes on to refer to the likes of Keats, Auden, Hampson, Lurid's Transformer, Virginia Woolf, Green from Scrapbooks, Brecht, George Michael, Max Weber, Nick Drake's Pink Moon, Grimm, Dory Previn, Electric Warrior, Nabokov misspelled here, of course. Whenever you mentioned people's names in the NME, they misspelled them, or pretty much in any rock publication. You were guaranteed that these writers had either not heard of who you were talking about, or would misspell them. Somewhere inside all these copious clues lies and hides Momus. He returns to his current hero, Peter Porter, the Australian poet who lived in London. You know, I went to a reading of his the other day, one of the 5 supposedly greatest living English poets, and there was a handful of people there. Terrible, terrible. He shakes his head, but Momus, his alert eagerness and clenched confidence somehow intact, is still smiling, albeit shyly. So much for the god of cynicism, concludes Jim Shelley. Then the second Momus enemy feature was about my Jacques Brel. Oh no, sorry, this is the sounds featured by Jack Barron. Moments in time, get it? There always had to be puns, you know, these sub-editors at the music papers just loved puns so much, they really did. So we did this interview in the YWCA, which is in Bloomsbury near the British Museum. Young women and Christians are the main themes of the upcoming Momus album, right, which I'm about to start work on, explains the one-man band with relish and his sweaty upper lip. I still do get a bit of a sweaty upper lip when I'm nervous, a bit less than I did. But I've noticed the face masks you have to wear now are quite good for hiding that. The album is going to be called Circus Maximus. I wouldn't say it was a concept record, but it does have distinct themes in the same way that my current 12-inch single, The Beast with Three Backs, has. In the album's case, the theme is of martyrdom. Do you feel like a martyr? Asks Jack Barron. Jack Barron now wears an eye patch, actually, like me. So I don't know what happened to his eye. No, I just find martyrdom very funny, and it seems a very typical situation. The Circus Maximus, or the Colosseum, where the Christians were thrown to the lions, is like the crucible of this syndrome. Do syndromes have crucibles? You don't think there's anything pretentious about Momus, says Jack. No, I hate this tag of intellectual and purple prose. My songs are actually much less abstract than most songs. Most songs about love and sex are really vague, they would say atmospheric. But I want my songs to observe the classic unities of time, place, and action. Aha, Aristotle reference, although I'm not sure if Jack would have picked that up. Actually, Jack once wrote this really cruel singles review, and cruel to all the other artists on Creation, saying that Momus was the possessor of 150 IQ points of Creation Records' collective 155. So, a little bit unkind there. But I want my songs to observe the classical unities of time, place, and action. I like specific details. Going back to what I was saying about martyrdom, sadism and masochism, they're all quite attractive. You can either be a Marxist or a Freudian, and I'm probably more of a Freudian. I like to think of everything springing from the use of sex or a redirection of sexual energy. For me, that's an enchanted way of looking at the world. I wonder if I was already into Gainsbourg at this point. I might well have been. I think I'd bought his Confidentiel album at that point. Things that are designed to be unpleasant or unsensual are for me a sort of sadism. Certainly there's no disputing the fact that the present Conservative government is basically sadistic and out of touch with its potential sexual warmth. And a lot of people are quite happy to respond by being masochistic. So I'm projecting sort of psychoanalytical categories onto the Thatcherite era. And this was influenced by a guy called David Badcock, whose lectures I attended at the LSE. And my friend Babis was a student at the London School of Economics and said, come down, gate crash, anyone can just walk in there and sit in on the lectures. So I sat in on some lectures on Marxism by Elie Kaduri, which were awful because Kaduri loved Hegel but hated Marx and thought that Marx was a fraud. But David Badcock, he had this course called Psychoanalysis of Society, which super influenced me because the idea was you could put a whole society, a whole culture on a couch and look at it as a kind of sick patient, So that's really what I proceeded to do in my songs, really, to show my wound in the Joseph Beuys phrase, but also that Badcockian, and I loved his name as well, David Badcock. Was it David Badcock? Badcock, anyway. That we had Badcocks, and it was quite interesting to analyse. You could analyse your own wounds and your own sicknesses, your own perversities, as a kind of microcosm of your society's sicknesses and perversities, which might be political as much as they were sexual. So it's a kind of post-anti-psychiatry, R.D. Laing kind of position as well. Did you used to sit in your bedroom and weep over girls you could never have, says Jack? Sure I did, and the most important thing was precisely the fact that I couldn't get involved with them. It was that aspect that I enjoyed the most, amplifying emotional suffering. I think most people go through that stage when they're growing up. So it's also quite Morrissey-esque, really, isn't it? Do you see yourself as an exhibitionist or a voyeur? Well, I'm very much both, I think. There speaks a certain honesty, concludes Jack. Momus, by the way, was the god of ridicule, blah, blah, blah. The problem with Venus, blah, blah, blah. The peeping Tom winks and checks into the Hotel Marquis de Sade to the Beauty and the Beast slithers. Already I was getting these projections of sort of Puritanism, but also of a kind of puckish, perverse, prurient sexuality. So they had my number. They kind of, the journalists were sussing me out. And for a while it worked in Britain. This intrigued them, this kind of persona. But then it stopped working because, as you'll see later, it's kind of interesting that you get features a bit later on saying, by now it must be apparent that Momus is a sexual pervert, and they start to really freak out a little bit around about the end of the decade. So I think also sexual morals were changing. Also, there was a weird kind of difference in sexual kind of attitudes between even different publications. So I would say I really noticed that Just 17 and Smash Hits, which were in the same office on Carnaby Street, actually the same building as NME was at the time, they had different attitudes sexually. So a lot of the writers at Smash Hits were quite puritanical, a bit awkward about writing about sex, and they would do it in this kind of sour way, super ironic way, if at all. Whereas Just 17 was much more direct because it was, addressing an audience of young girls who were interested in makeup and clothes and, being attractive. And so it was a much more direct and honest sexuality in Just 17, the floor above, than in Smash Hits, which was all kind of squirmy and campy as well, very camp, because Neil Tennant had recently been the editor there. I just missed the Neil Tennant era of Smash Hits. But I did run into Neil Tennant a lot. I kept bumping into him in restaurants and chatting with him and stuff. Here is a magazine called The Beat. Momus, I suppose what I'm really trying to do is make music that people can shut their eyes to. It's not really Red Wedge, is it? Well, this is, again, this kind of demarcation. I'm kind of drawing boundaries between myself and the other artists in a slightly... not a snobby way, but I think I really wanted, I was much more interested in psychoanalysis and self-analysis and closing your eyes and imagining future worlds, and rather than, trying to support Neil Kinnock's campaign to become leader of the Labour Party or whatever Billy Bragg would have been doing. Indeed, no, but this is no dreary sloganeer hell-bent on shouting very loud to make the kids understand. It is Nicholas Curry, just turned 26 and under the name of Momus, making quietly irresistible records. See, I was really quite old to be starting a music career in my mid-20s. I should have started 5 years earlier. His first EP, blah, blah, blah. Is it a religious LP? No, it's more like laughing into the void. The only thing to do when you realise there is no God. So, religious themes, but not a religious person. However, the paraphernalia of Christianity is something I find very appealing. I suppose as a system of symbols and signs, I find Christianity interesting to write about. And the biography that accompanies the record tells of Nicholas's great-grandparents who left the Church of Scotland because there were publicans in the pews and joined the Plymouth Brethren, a puritanical sect of extreme Protestants. All true. That's my father's side grandparents. Young Nicholas was warned of the dangers of demon drink, but his forbidden pleasures came elsewhere. We lived in this really bourgeois area of Edinburgh, and there were these great gardens behind the houses. The caretaker's children were rough and rebellious, and they smoked. We were told never to talk to them. And so ever since I've been fascinated by tough, delinquent people. I suppose it's because I'm the total opposite. So again, this kind of weird masochistic thing of being on the side of those who are different from me, who are not like me precisely. Raised in Montreal and Athens, he was sent to boarding school in Edinburgh, my exile from Eden, quote, whilst there, only 3 records, all by David Bowie, kept him from total despair. The Man Who Sold the World, Hunky Dory, and Space Oddity. I loved the way that those LPs could put gentle ballads next to incredibly loud and sinister outbursts. It's that kind of feel I've aimed for in what I do. The Momus sound wriggles away from description at every turn. One moment it's a darker prefab sprout, the next it's a savage growl. A forthcoming EP of schizoid songs looks set to quite rightfully confuse things further. So where can it all end up? I've always liked inventing new worlds. I think I'd like to see things get more extreme, I say, and that's the end. And it's written by someone called Wilbur, whoever that is. It's funny, you do kind of memorize your early press. A lot of these are very familiar to me as a kind of the establishment of the Momus character, who's not that different from the real me, you know. She's sort of a sort of heightened and lurid version of the real me. But the music press was a kind of playground or a kind of monopoly game where you could, they would give you a certain amount of fake money at the beginning of the game, and then you could spend that in different ways by making different statements to different people as you progress through the game, amassing a fortune, you know, becoming a pop star or not, as the case may be. So here we come to some reviews. The reviews are better known because a lot of them are on my website. We get this Lord of the Ring, which is the enemy's response to Circus Maximus. It starts to get aggressive. They start to get a bit nasty towards me. Although it sounds like the type of name which Fish might have considered initially as an alternative to Marillion. Momus is the title of Nick Carey's latest musical, blah, blah, blah. So the record conjures up slightly cloying images of a group of sensitive friends sitting in a circle on cushions as they chuckle and cluck together in unison. So it's a kind of idea that this is preaching to the choir, a little choir of sensitive and refined people like himself, who perhaps don't even exist or are so minimal in terms of numbers that they're not going to be significant to us, the music press. There is this kind of contract you have with the music press whereby when you have more fans than they have readers, you're a powerful name, a mainstream name. But when you have fewer fans than they have readers, they are in a position to help you. So it's almost like getting a bank loan or something, getting an advance. They advanced you their large readership, which for the enemy at that time would have been about 100,000 weekly readers. And then if you can do something with those 100,000 people, i.e. excite them enough to get them buying your records, then you will continue to appear in the music press after that. And if you get more than 100,000 record sales, you will then be helping the music press to attract new readers, you know. So it's kind of like, we'll give you a leg up and then we'll see how you do. And if you do better than we're doing, i.e. 100,000 sales, we'll continue to cover you. But if you don't, you will be forever in our debt, and we'll start to think you're a bad debt. We're never going to get that money back. That attention we put on you was a waste of time. We could have put it on someone who was going to get bigger than you got. So I never obviously really sold 100,000 records. I was selling about 10,000 of these things, these creation albums. So I was indulged. And I had to, at that point, when you're sort of there on sufferance, you have to be nice to them. You have to kind of play the game. And I was a bit aggressive and kind of resentful. I don't know. I think I got a bit bored. And I started, by the early 90s, I definitely started trying to sabotage myself by saying unacceptable things in interviews. Like football fans should have to interbreed with other races, for instance, because they're obviously degraded. A bit like when Hillary Clinton talked about undesirables or whatever term she had. So here's the smash hits. This is Vicky, my girlfriend of the time, putting me into smash hits. This was me trying to pull the strings of, trying to date important people in the music industry to further my career. I dated my manager, I dated my plugger, I dated journalists, and probably others too. Probably escapes me. I mean, you're in this kind of small world where there are. Oh yes, the paste-up artist on this record. I dated her for a while. Then she married Bill Drummond of the KLF. It's all in niche. Forthcoming in 1 month. You can read it all. But I had to change the names because I went through it with a lawyer, and she said, well, professionally, it's not very good for that person. Is she still in the music industry? Your manager who you slept with? Because, that could be lawsuits from that, because it's damaging to her reputation that she slept with her clients. And I had to say, well, we only slept together before. She was my manager, and then after we didn't anymore. But, it just got really silly. So I had to change everybody's names. So it's all fake names now, which kind of annoyed me. Anyway, here we are on Smash Hits. On the left, this is the Smash Hits speak of the time. On the left, we have two not attractive, i.e. not very attractive paintings of gentlemen with arrows sticking out of them. The one above is Christian martyr Saint Sebastian, who was shot with arrows by the Romans, as painted by Botticelli. The one below, however, is Scottish pop, inverted commas, artiste Momus, real name Nicholas Curry, merely masquerading as the unfortunate saint in order to decorate the cover of his recently released and rather good first LP, Circus Maximus. Of course, the fact that it's sort of a Mishima pastiche on my part, rather than going straight back to Botticelli, would have escaped the readers of Smash Hits. Although Vicky had gone to the Royal College of Art and was a very highly educated person, so she would have known that, I'm sure. Saint Sebastian, I'm quoted as saying, was someone who went out in a glamorously masochistic way, as did Mishima, of course, explains Nick somewhat obscurely of his, inverted commas, pose. Poor old inverted commas in the 80s really got overused, didn't they? He didn't really come into his own until many of the mainly gay Renaissance painters wanted an excuse to paint an unclothed, beautiful-looking man with all these arrows sticking in him. It was a very erotic subject for them, ... says Vicky, a little bit disturbed already, because Smash Hits is not really a place where you talk about sex without kind of Benny Hill kind of smutty innuendo. And why, on closer inspection, do so many of the apparently charming acoustic songs on the album turn out to be somewhat twisted versions of the more steamy, inverted commas, parts of the Bible? Well, people who haven't read the Bible don't know what they're missing. It's really, really sexy, I explain. Most people think of Christians as loonies crazed by their attempts to stop themselves having sex before marriage, but the Christians I'm singing about weren't like that. The Romans threw them to the lions, but the martyrs got the last laugh. They were masochists. They got their pleasure from self-sacrifice and their power from guilt. That's a heavily psychoanalytical line. I could imagine someone like Adam Phillips talking about that now. So, Nick, says Vicky, are you religious? No. Oh. And that's, the article just finishes with Vicky saying, oh. And it's kind of, between the lines, it's like, he's bonkers, he's crazy. Here I am with black hair, my God, in Melody Maker. I dyed my hair black in 1986. Martyr or heretic? A poet or pranit? See, I don't even know what a pranit is. I guess it's a prat. Momus says one extraordinary thing, say the Stud Brothers. I'm not sure who the Stud Brothers were. I think they really were brothers, though. Momus had a fantasy. The first sexual dream I can ever remember having was at 6 years old, being in a classroom with boys and girls. I was just sitting there at my desk, and this girl that I knew from nursery school came up and thrust this spear through me. I said, why did you do that? And she said, it's the spear of love. Oh, that's all right then. In the second paragraph of a music press feature, I'm already talking about my earliest sexual dreams and memories. It's kind of amazing. Why did I have this exhibitionistic urge to let it all hang out? I must have been such a hippie. Or such a kind of Calvinist, maybe, I don't know. Momus appeared almost naked on the cover of an album called Circus Maximus. He swoons as arrows pierce his narrow chest, blah, blah, blah. Momus is ambitious. He wants to break down our values by reasoning poetically, by being listenable. And they say I'm almost too listenable on Circus Maximus, a bit Al Stewart, Ben Watt, Hunky Dory. He's understandably satisfied, a singing author in the French-Italian tradition, propelled by the desire to communicate ideas by words rather than music. As such, Momus would seem to be something of an intellectual, oh dear. His continuous literary references, his views on sex and subversion might point to a tendency to value reason above other mental and emotional faculties. All I do is talk about sex, and they say that I don't value emotional faculties. Come on. What stops him mistaking the intellect for passion is his weakness for high romance. It opposes the cynic within him, while at the same time making his cynicism special. I'm not quite sure what that means. Almost talking to himself, Momus sighs, I must be a very strange person. What I do will either be totally incomprehensible or just wonderful. You have to blow your own trumpet. And the walls of Jericho.
Open University.
So it's a live review here. Kev episodes, big portions, blah, blah, blah. Kev's is the place to be these Tuesday evenings, by the way. This was a club in Soho in a basement, and it was organised by my press officer at L Records, Dave Harper. And I think I did a concert from the top of a ladder. So Momus proves himself. Strumming almost casually on an acoustic guitar, erring just on the right side of being too quiet, Momus proves himself to be the country's most enticing lyricist in the country. The country's most enticing lyricist in the country. And having much in common with Jacques Brel, some of whose songs he covered last year, in his grasp of how to juggle the ambiguity and precision of love's more dangerous moments. Well, you see, these people think I'm dealing with love. I don't know why the other guys, those brothers, didn't. The savage, I don't know, some of these are, that's the same thing, the same review. The savagery that scuttles beneath the flesh of Momus's creations is neatly disguised by a lyrical beauty and musical ease that could charm and socks off even the hardest cynic. That was kind of the project, was to have, and I think I'm explicit about that a bit later, to have ugly content, but beautiful form wrapped around it. It was kind of a subversive project. Then there's my piece about Jacques Brel, Laughing in the Face of Death. So I was writing in the world music section of The Enemy about Brel and Brassens and Gainsbourg, I think. Did I write about Brassens? Maybe not. And there was going to be a feature about Jake Thackeray as well, and an interview was set up, and I screwed it up by getting there late, and he'd already left, so it never happened. So the stuff about the Brel translations here. Momus in Love. This is The Enemy feature about Jacques Brel, Don Watson. So Don Watson became a friend. He was kind of an epigone follower of the great intellectual powerhouses of Penman and Morley. And so people like Stuart Maconie and Don Watson were kind of following on from that, but not with the same kind of insistence. I think a slightly more compromised version in a slightly more compromised time for the music press. Here I am in my Sloane Square living room. Sloane Square D-Ranger, they say in the caption, D-Ranger. I would obviously hate to be associated with the Sloane Rangers, but I don't mind being a Sloane D-Ranger. The Sloane Ranger, for those who don't know the cultural history, they were sort of these yuppies who swanned around buying expensive things on Sloane Street. Momus, blah, 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 Don Watson, it's the sound of hurdy-gurdies. It's all about Jacques Brel, this one. The sound of hurdy-gurdies, that's what I want. In Edinburgh, there used to be this old woman who wandered around with a hurdy-gurdy on her back, playing for money, and the sound was sort of hard, glittering, ramshackle music. Evan and Elle. This is a big feature in Sounds about Elle Records. It's mostly an interview with Mike Allway. I get the lead picture here. And here we're in July 1986. Johnny Brown from the band of Holy Joy, talking about Momus Don't Leave. This is the only record I bought so far this year, and it's a contemporary one. We were kind of making common cause. Here's a picture of me with my black hair again. So we're in Melody Maker. Yeah, because Johnny Brown was doing sort of Brechtian accordion music, which appealed to me as well. All you need is Momus. They're running out of puns, aren't they? All you need is Momus. It doesn't even work as a pun. That's the standard Walker print, the standard publicity picture from L Records. Me with my Ray-Bans, again, very 80s. And this is an interview by Alan McCusker Thompson, who had a band called The Painted Word. He was also a Scot in exile in London. He had a really good band, very influenced by Jacques Brel, called The Painted Word. And he's just asked me, questions. So your songs are bursting with references to real people and real events. What part does realism play in your material? I think in a way, realism and escapism are much the same thing these days. There's a certain horrible exotic glamour about AIDS and Chernobyl. They're real, they're here, and they may be in your blood at this very moment, or mine. Kind of similar to what I was saying about COVID-19. If they're in my blood, why not in my songs? Recently signed to Alan McGee's Creation label. How do they see you and what are their recording plans? At my first couple of meetings with McGee, he was saying things like the most intelligent man in pop and the yuppie market and something that appealed to face readers. I just sat there opening and closing my mouth. I had a few words with him and we agreed a change of image would be cheaper than a Jim Kerr type lobotomy. Oh dear. See, I sort of attacked all these people that I had things in common with. I won't say what I have in common with Jim Kerr, but I think I also attacked Prefab Sprout in saying that I really admired their songs, but that writing songs on a daily basis as kind of exercises in form was something I couldn't ever approve of. So we took some pictures outside the scummiest brothels in Soho and decided to title the LP Lusts of a Moron, which of course became a title of my lyrics collection later. It wasn't the title for the Poison Boyfriend. Poison Boyfriend was also going to be called, it was going to be BBC One and all sorts of other things too. Is the pop context sophisticated enough to impart your ideas? And I respond, I'm an idiot. I don't have any ideas before I pick up a guitar. Certain chord sequences just catch certain words and feelings like flypaper catching flies. Sometimes I like to think of myself as the stranger children are told never to accept sweets from, oh dear. A pervert corrupting the innocence of pop, and innocence as money filthy as my corruption is pure poor. But then I tell myself, go tell it to Janet Jackson. Michael Jackson, maybe more appropriately. Expecting sophistication from pop is like expecting cancer from cigarettes. It'll come in the end, but not yet. Please, not yet. I've done 42, 43, 44 minutes already. That's kind of way too much. So I think I'll have to continue this on another day. My back pages.
Open University.